She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, eyes narrowed, not in concern, but in command. Either you serve Keith, or you can leave. Her voice didn't waver, and for a moment, neither did I. Then I smiled, a calm, painful kind of smile. I walked upstairs, pulled my suitcase from the closet, and packed like someone who'd done this before. But I hadn't. Not really. Not after giving up everything, my house, my pension, my pride, for the daughter I once rocked to sleep through thunderstorms. I left without a single word of protest. No begging, no breakdown. They thought they had won. But what they didn't know was this. I wasn't walking away. I was stepping into phase 1 of a plan I'd been too patient to use. And by the time it was done, they'd learn what happens when you try to erase the woman who gave you everything. The sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting soft golden rays across the countertops Margaret had scrubbed clean just an hour earlier. A pot of beef stew simmered quietly on the stove, its aroma drifting through the house like a memory from better times. Margaret stood at the sink, rinsing the last plate from breakfast. Her hands, worn and freckled with age, moved with the precision of habit, a lifetime of care woven into every chore. She could hear the television blaring from the living room, Keith's laughter echoing as he watched some mid-morning sports show. Danielle was upstairs, likely scrolling through her phone or folding laundry. Margaret had spent the past 4 years under this roof, her roof technically, cooking, cleaning, paying bills, and being told, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence, that she was overstaying her welcome. It hadn't always been this way. After Robert died, cancer, swift and cruel, Margaret's world had contracted. No more shared breakfasts, no crossword puzzles over coffee, no laughter echoing from their little garden in spring. Danielle had insisted she move in with them. "You shouldn't be alone, Mom. We have the space now. Let us take care of you." And Margaret, grieving and tired, had agreed, but taking care of her soon morphed into her taking care of everything. She had dipped into her pension to help with the down payment. Then came the tuition bills for Danielle's master's degree. When Keith lost his job for 6 months, Margaret covered their mortgage and groceries, telling herself that's what families did. That's what Robert would have wanted. It was easier to believe that than to admit the truth, that they needed her more than they loved her. Still, she kept going. She cooked dinner every night, packed lunches when she noticed they forgot, took Danielle's car in for oil changes, even called Keith's boss once to defend him when he didn't show up to work. Not once had she asked for anything in return. Today had started like any other. Coffee, breakfast, cleaning. Then Keith, lounging on the couch with his feet up, hollered toward the kitchen. "Hey, Maggie, grab me a beer, will ya?" Margaret paused. Her name wasn't Maggie, and he knew that. She turned, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and walked to the doorway. "Keith, I'm cooking. You can get it yourself." Keith didn't look away from the screen. "Come on, you're already in there." Danielle walked in at that moment, hearing only part of the exchange. "What's the problem now?" Keith chuckled. "Your mom's getting feisty." Margaret stared at her daughter, hoping, just hoping, for a flicker of recognition, of solidarity, of the girl who once cried at the thought of hurting her feelings. But Danielle crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "Mom, it's just a beer. Why do you have to make everything difficult?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Then Keith, emboldened, turned fully toward her. "Look, either you help out around here without the attitude, or maybe it's time you find somewhere else to live. We've talked about this, haven't we, babe?" Danielle nodded. "Yeah, we have." Margaret felt her breath catch. "You've talked about me leaving?" "We just can't keep walking on eggshells," Danielle muttered, looking anywhere but at her mother. "You get upset over every little thing. Keith's right, this tension isn't healthy." "Tension?" Margaret repeated, her voice thin. "I clean your house, I pay your bills, I make your meals. What exactly have I done to create tension?" "You're just always there, judging, making us feel guilty for living our lives." For a moment, Margaret saw herself from their eyes, a 62-year-old widow in sensible clothes and soft shoes, always puttering around the house, always present, never belonging. She didn't cry, Not this time. Instead, she smiled. Not warmly, not sadly, just a small, quiet smile, the kind that closes a door. "All right," she said, turning back toward the stairs. "I understand." Keith blinked. "Wait, what does that mean?" "It means," she said without turning, "you'll get your beer yourself." And she climbed the stairs slowly, deliberately, each step echoing louder than the last. Upstairs, she opened the closet and reached for her suitcase, the same one she'd used on her honeymoon with Robert. She placed it on the bed and began packing, not frantically, not angrily, just efficiently. 2 pairs of jeans, her best blouses, undergarments, medications, a photograph of Robert and Danielle at her 5th birthday party, her grandmother's rosary. She zipped the suitcase and sat beside it for a moment, hands folded in her lap. Downstairs, laughter resumed. The television buzzed. No one followed. They didn't think she'd leave. But Margaret wasn't breaking. She was done bending. The soft click of her suitcase handle extending into place echoed through the room like a gavel coming down. Margaret stood over it, brushing invisible lint from her cardigan, then walked slowly to her desk drawer. Inside, she kept a small notebook, a ledger really, where she tracked every check, transfer, and expense since moving in. It was a habit born from years of managing 2 jobs and 1 daughter as a single-income household. She paused, fingers tracing the numbers. The entries were neat, methodical. Every month, her pension check came in. Every month, 3/4 of it went out. Mortgage contribution, groceries, utility supplements, emergencies like Keith's speeding tickets or Danielle's overdue credit card. It was all there. Every sacrifice, every unacknowledged act of love. Her eyes moved to a sticky note Keith had left stuck to the screen last week. It had looked like a harmless reminder. Check pension transfer security? At the time, she assumed he was helping Danielle, but now, standing in the half-packed room, Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. She opened her laptop. The browser history was there, unhidden. Keith had logged in using her saved credentials, multiple times. She recognized the exact dates, always when she was out shopping or at her church group. Not once had he asked permission. He wasn't curious, he was monitoring. She clicked deeper and found searches. How to add beneficiary to bank account. Can you withdraw from someone else's retirement account? One search chilled her the most. Power of attorney for elderly parent not of sound mind. Her breath caught. Margaret sat down, staring at the screen. The quiet hum of her laptop felt louder than any argument ever could. This was never about helping her. It had never even been about family. It had been about control. And worse, inheritance, manipulation, theft, just dressed in family terms. She thought back to those early years when it was just her and Danielle in that 2-bedroom apartment over the laundromat. She had worked nights at the diner, days at the elementary school as a lunch supervisor, and weekends cleaning offices. There were weeks she barely slept. Once she collapsed at a PTA meeting and woke up in the nurse's office with Danielle holding her hand, whispering, "Don't die, Mommy." Now that same daughter had watched her husband treat Margaret like hired help and said nothing. Worse, she'd nodded in agreement. The betrayal didn't feel like a sharp stab. It was dull, lingering, slow, like erosion, like something beautiful worn down by time and neglect. Margaret didn't cry, not even when she reached for the framed picture of Danielle in her high school cap and gown, the photo she'd kept on her nightstand since graduation. She wrapped it in a towel and laid it gently in the suitcase. She took one last look around the room. The worn dresser, the quilt her mother had made, the lamp with the flickering bulb that Danielle always said she'd replace but never did. Margaret wasn't angry anymore. Anger required energy, and she had none left to spare for people who didn't see her as more than a burden. She wheeled her suitcase down the hallway. The hum of the television still echoed from the living room. As she reached the top of the stairs, she heard Keith laugh and call out, "Hope you got that beer, Maggie." Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she turned into the small alcove near the coat closet. There, on the little stand by the door, was the bowl where she kept her spare keys. She dropped hers in with a metallic clink. Next to it, she left the sticky note Keith had written. She had scribbled one word underneath his message in neat all-caps handwriting. Goodbye. She opened the front door. No one turned around. The sunlight was blinding. It was almost noon. Margaret walked down the steps, suitcase bumping softly against each riser, then turned left and began the long walk toward the bus stop at the end of the block. Not once did she look back. Not when the door stayed closed behind her. Not when her shadow stretched long in front of her. Not when she reached the corner and waited for the bus, hands folded over the suitcase handle, a woman completely invisible to the household she had financed. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that Margaret wasn't just walking away. She was drawing a line, and she was about to teach them all what it looked like when a woman redrew the map of her worth. The bus rattled along the county road, each bump in the pavement echoing through Margaret's bones like a drumbeat. Her suitcase sat beside her, its worn leather edges frayed, the handle faded from years of use. It had been a gift from Robert, a purchase they made together on a rainy afternoon in 1984 when they were preparing for their honeymoon trip to the Great Smoky Mountains. She'd barely used it since. Until now, she watched the town blur past. Strip malls, aging gas stations, a shuttered bookstore she once loved. Every mile widened the distance between her and the life she thought she'd built forever. Danielle hadn't called. Keith hadn't even noticed she'd left. The bus hissed to a stop outside Pine Ridge Motel, a squat U-shaped building painted a tired yellow. The neon vacancy sign blinked unevenly, casting a weak pink hue onto the gravel lot. Margaret stepped down from the bus, dragging her suitcase across the uneven pavement toward the office. Inside, a teenage boy barely looked up from his phone as he slid her a registration form. "Weekly rates cheaper," he mumbled. Margaret nodded and handed over her debit card. The transaction beeped. No questions asked. Room 7 was at the far end, next to an ice machine that coughed every hour. The door creaked open to reveal a tiny space with a bed, a nightstand, and a table barely large enough to hold a lamp and a chipped coffee mug. The sheets smelled of bleach, and the carpet bore the stains of hundreds of forgotten travelers. Still, it was hers, and for the first time in years, Margaret locked the door behind her and felt peace instead of fear. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped in her lap. The silence was deafening, but she welcomed it. No shouting, no passive-aggressive sighs, no demands for beer. She glanced at the clock. 12:47 p.m. There was work to be done. Margaret retrieved her laptop from the suitcase, plugged it in, and opened her online banking portal. The familiar interface brought a small sense of order. Years of diligence had kept her finances intact despite everything she'd given. She opened the list she had prepared weeks ago in secret, a document labeled Exit Plan. First, she logged into the mortgage portal for Danielle and Keith's house. She'd set up automatic payments 5 years ago, thinking it was a temporary gesture. She clicked Cancel Recurring Payment, and a pop-up warned her about missed payments and penalties. She clicked Confirm without hesitation. Next, she opened her insurance provider's site. Both Keith's Silverado and Danielle's compact SUV were listed under her account. She navigated to Remove Insured Vehicles and submitted the forms. She even left a note in the file. Policy no longer applicable. Drivers no longer reside with policyholder. Then came the credit cards. Margaret stared at the screen for a moment. Danielle's name was listed as an authorized user on 3 accounts. Margaret had never seen the statements in full before. Keith's streaming subscriptions, Danielle's online shopping, even furniture bought for their guest room that Margaret never used. She opened the chat window and typed, "Please remove all authorized users immediately. I am the sole cardholder and responsible party." Within minutes, the response came back. Confirmed. It was done. A weight lifted from her chest. For years, she had justified every dollar spent as love. But love was not supposed to be a transaction. It wasn't supposed to come with an invoice or a deadline. And it certainly wasn't supposed to make her feel invisible. Margaret stood and walked to the motel window, staring out at the dusty road and a distant field of overgrown grass. She remembered the day she and Robert had moved into the old white house on Rosemont Avenue. Danielle, just 4 years old, running barefoot across the lawn, chasing soap bubbles. They had saved for years to buy that house, skipped vacations, shared one car. Robert patched the roof himself, and Margaret baked pies for the real estate office just to sweeten the deal. It had been their castle. Now it was the place she'd been exiled from like an unwanted tenant. Her chest tightened. Not from sadness, but from clarity. This was her clean slate. She turned back to the desk, pulled out her notebook, and began listing everything that still bore her name. Bank accounts, insurance, subscriptions. She drew neat boxes next to each, labeled keep, transfer, cancel. No more half measures, no more bleeding quietly to keep others comfortable. Margaret wasn't just cutting them off financially, she was reclaiming her name, her agency, her dignity. And it felt good. The motel's ice machine coughed awake again, punctuating the quiet hum of Margaret's thoughts. She sat cross-legged on the bed, her notebook open on her lap. The title at the top of the page read, Emotional Exit Plan, Phase 1. Beneath it, carefully drawn lines split the paper into stages. Detachment, clarity, assertion, peace. It sounded clinical, surgical even, but Margaret had learned long ago that survival wasn't always about strength. It was about structure. She had built a life on lists, grocery budgets, school calendars, work shifts. Now she was building her escape. Not from a place, but from an emotional prison she'd allowed herself to live in far too long. She flipped to the next page and began listing triggers. Danielle's disappointed sighs, Keith's casual entitlement, the way they only touched her when they needed something, the moments of silence around the dinner table when she spoke and no one answered, tiny wounds that had festered into something infected and unrecognizable. Her pen paused. Next to the word resentment, she wrote in parentheses, doesn't go away by waiting for an apology. She closed the notebook and powered up her laptop again. There was still more damage to assess. Her bank's fraud alert tab blinked in the corner of the screen. She hadn't noticed it earlier. With a few clicks, she opened the flagged reports. There it was, an alert from 2 months ago. Someone had attempted to use her address and part of her social security number on a loan application. The amount requested $50,000. Margaret's breath caught. The name on the application was familiar, Keith Sanders. The document was surprisingly official looking. It listed her home address. The justification section read, Home Equity Loan for Renovations. The digital signature matched his handwriting. She knew because he once scribbled his name on a thank you card she'd written for Danielle's bridal shower guests. He misspelled his own last name with 2 S's. The reality dropped like a stone into her gut. This wasn't just emotional manipulation anymore. Keith had been trying to steal from her, not metaphorically, literally. He had attempted to use her house, the one she'd paid for, the one she'd let them live in for free, as collateral for a loan he intended to use without her knowledge. A dozen memories surged like waves. Keith complaining about how hard it is for men these days, how the system was stacked against him, how Margaret owed it to them for all the strain she supposedly caused in their marriage. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from fury. And beneath it all, a cold, strange clarity. He had never seen her as family. She had been an ATM with a heart. Margaret reached for her phone, then paused. She could call the bank. She could press charges. But first, she needed evidence. She opened a document on her desktop and labeled it Keith Sanders. Fraud documentation. She began screenshotting everything. The application timestamp, IP address used, the address listed, the forged signature. Then she opened a new folder titled Phase 2, Legal Prep. No more illusions. No more pretending this was salvageable. The pain twisted in her chest. But it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't grief. It was something like a severing, a deliberate snip of the thread that had tethered her to people who had stopped treating her like a human being. She stood and walked to the motel window. Across the parking lot, a young couple was loading suitcases into a pickup truck. They looked exhausted but relieved, maybe visiting family, maybe escaping them. The woman looked back once, her expression unreadable, then climbed in and shut the door. Margaret envied their momentum. She had been stuck in the same emotional gears for too long, grinding, stalling, circling the same potholes of guilt and hope. Not anymore. Back at the table, she opened her email and began drafting messages to her attorney, her insurance agent, and her bank fraud department. Each line was precise, detached, focused. Subject, unauthorized loan attempt, fraudulent application under my name. She attached the screenshots, explained her relationship to the suspect, and requested that all correspondence regarding the property be directed only to her, the sole deed holder. With each email sent, something inside her uncoiled. For years, Margaret had confused kindness with passivity. She'd believed that love meant giving until there was nothing left. But now, she saw it clearly. Boundaries were not betrayals. They were survival. When she hit send on the final message, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled deeply. It was done. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't begged. She had simply drawn the line. And for the first time in years, Margaret Lewis felt free. Margaret's phone buzzed for the fourth time that morning, its vibrations muffled under the layers of her quilted purse. She didn't bother reaching for it. She already knew who it was. The missed call screen had become a revolving door of familiar names. Danielle, Keith, unknown, and one curious, blocked ID. Each message was a different flavor of panic. The first voicemail had come late Sunday night. Danielle's voice had been strained, clipped. "Hey Mom, just checking in. We noticed the mortgage didn't go through this month. Is everything okay with the bank?" She'd tried to mask her concern, but the edge was there. By Monday afternoon, the tone had changed. "Mom, this is serious." Danielle's voice crackled through the recording. "The bank called again. They said we're behind. Keith is talking to the loan officer today, but can you call me back, please?" Margaret had listened but hadn't responded. Then came Keith. No preamble, no softening. "What the hell, Margaret? You cut us off without a word? You think that's okay? We're trying to fix this, but you're making us look like criminals. You can't just disappear and leave everything in chaos." Margaret had played that one twice, not for the content, but for the tone. Somewhere between desperation and accusation, Keith had started unraveling. That afternoon, she bought a new notepad from the pharmacy near the motel and began jotting down the times of each call, the mood shifts, and her emotional reactions. Not to dwell, but to document. She was done being caught off guard. By Wednesday, Keith's voicemails had grown theatrical. "I know this isn't you, Margaret. Someone's feeding you lies. Maybe the bank's trying to turn you against us. This isn't right. You're not well. We should be helping you, not the other way around." Margaret paused that message halfway through. Her fingers tightened around the phone. There it was. He was laying the groundwork, the narrative. Margaret is confused. Margaret is mentally declining. Margaret needs intervention. It wasn't enough to leech off her finances. Now he was trying to claim her mind. She stood by the motel window, staring out at the rain that had started falling in slow, steady sheets. The world outside was gray, the kind of weather that made most people want to curl up under blankets and wait for better skies. But Margaret didn't feel small or powerless. She felt watched. Not in a paranoid way, but in the way someone feels when their life is being rewritten by people who aren't in the room. Keith had always been careful with his words around others, never cruel enough to leave bruises, never loud enough to raise suspicion. But Margaret saw through it now. This wasn't sudden concern. It was a calculated strategy. If he could convince people she was unstable, he could justify his actions, discredit her withdrawal, question her choices, lay the foundation for control. She opened her laptop and began typing a new document, False Narrative Defense. Each message paraphrased and time-stamped. Her own memories from the past few months added in. The look on his face when she hesitated before handing over her debit card. The way Danielle brushed off her discomfort with a joke or a sigh. By the time the rain tapered off in the late afternoon, Margaret had filled 5 pages. Then came the email. Subject: Family concern urgent. It was from Keith. The body was simple. Margaret, I've scheduled an appointment with Dr. Reynolds to discuss your memory lapses and recent behavior. We think it's time someone steps in professionally. I'll send the details tomorrow. Margaret stared at the screen. Her hands didn't tremble. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. Keith wasn't just spinning a story. He was weaponizing care, using the language of concern as a tool to regain access, and perhaps even paint himself as the hero of a fabricated crisis. She knew what this was. It was a power grab wrapped in concern. Margaret clicked forward and sent the message to her attorney with the subject line: premeditated manipulation attempt. No commentary, no emotion, just evidence. Because silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. And Margaret Lewis was done being caught in anyone's web. Margaret pulled her raincoat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped through the glass doors of First Alliance Bank. The warmth of the lobby was a welcome contrast to the damp chill outside. She hadn't been here in over a year, not since helping Danielle and Keith apply for a financial reassessment on their auto loan. Back then, she'd signed as co-guarantor, at their insistence. Today's visit had nothing to do with helping. Margaret Lewis? A familiar voice called from behind the teller counter. Margaret turned and saw Cheryl Hart, her former co-worker and one of the bank's senior loan officers. They'd worked together nearly 2 decades ago before Cheryl moved to the mortgage department. Now her neat bob haircut and efficient demeanor hadn't changed a bit. Cheryl, Margaret smiled faintly, I was hoping you'd still be here. They hugged briefly. Cheryl motioned her toward a small, glass-walled office. Come in. You look like you're here on a mission. I am, Margaret replied, her voice quiet but firm. Once they were seated, Margaret slid a folder across the desk. I need to ask about a home equity loan application. Keith Sanders. He used my home address, Rosemont Avenue, and my name was tied to the property. I want to know if anything suspicious came through. Cheryl frowned, pulling up the system. Her fingers tapped quickly, searching through records. Her eyes narrowed. There it is. Applied under his name 3 months ago. Claimed joint ownership. Said the house was a gift from his mother-in-law and he was finalizing the paperwork. Margaret's lips thinned. I never signed a thing. Cheryl clicked through more screens. That's what caught our eye. The title deed showed your name only, no transfer activity. We flagged it for review and rejected the loan, but Margaret, the paperwork he submitted looked convincing. He had a notarized letter claiming you were mentally unfit to manage property alone and had authorized him to act on your behalf. A slow, acidic burn rose in Margaret's chest. Forgery, she said softly. Cheryl nodded grimly. I didn't want to believe it at first. But when we saw your signature, it didn't match previous records. We logged it and flagged his profile for potential fraud. Margaret took a slow breath. Do you still have the documentation? Cheryl hesitated, then opened a locked cabinet behind her. I shouldn't show you this without legal channels, but we both know what's happening here. She handed Margaret a folder. Inside were copies of the forged letter, the loan form, and a photocopy of her driver's license, clearly taken without her knowledge. The last page showed a fake power of attorney form, supposedly signed in front of a notary named Susan Lang. Margaret's voice was steel. I've never met a Susan Lang, and I never gave him power of attorney. Cheryl leaned in. If you file a police report, we'll cooperate fully. This crosses into criminal territory. Margaret nodded. I'll handle it. But the storm wasn't over yet. Later that afternoon, as she sipped coffee in the corner booth of Annie's Cafe, her phone buzzed again. This time with a message from Marla Jennings, an old friend from church who worked as a receptionist at the Women's Wellness Clinic. Hey, Margaret, I heard Danielle told you she's pregnant. Thought you'd want to know. She's not on Dr. Kim's appointment list this week or next, and we haven't seen her in months. Could be a mix-up, but I thought you'd want to know. Margaret stared at the screen. The last piece fell into place with a sickening thud. The pregnancy was a lie, a manipulation tool, One last desperate thread to pull at Margaret's heartstrings, to coerce her back into their orbit. All those tearful voicemails, the trembling voice, the mention of a doctor's warning about stress and miscarriage, it had all been orchestrated. Margaret didn't even finish her coffee. She walked straight to the motel, shut the door behind her, and pulled out her legal pad. On one sheet, she wrote in bold marker, "Evidence package, mortgage loan forgery, Cheryl's documents, false pregnancy claim, Marla's confirmation, voicemails implying mental incompetence, email coercing medical guardianship, prior financial leeching, bank statements, card activity." She scanned the documents one by one, saved them in a secure cloud folder, and printed hard copies for her attorney. For years, Margaret had believed that silence protected peace. But now, she saw it for what it was, a weapon they counted on her to keep wielding against herself. No more. She wasn't just defending herself now. She was building her case, and it would be airtight. The clerk at the Flathead County Courthouse stamped the final page with a heavy thud, her movements practiced, efficient. "Your request for a restraining order has been filed, Ms. Lewis," she said without looking up. "A sheriff's deputy will deliver it to Mr. Sanders within 48 hours. Violation of the order will result in immediate arrest." Margaret offered a small nod, but her chest remained tight. The legal jargon was clear. Keith could no longer come within 500 feet of her or her property. But what about the emotional space she still carried? The sting of betrayal hadn't faded with the ink of the papers. Still, it was progress. That same afternoon, she met with Detective Langston at the local police precinct. His office was cluttered with case files and coffee mugs, but his demeanor was sharp and respectful. "You've got quite the portfolio here," he said, flipping through her evidence binder. "Fake power of attorney, forged signatures, false medical claims. You've been thorough." "I was a bookkeeper for 30 years, Margaret replied flatly. "I know how to track a paper trail." Langston grinned slightly. "It's clear you've been manipulated for a long time, but it's also clear you've finally drawn your line." Margaret folded her hands. "I want to make sure it holds." "Then let's make sure this guy knows you're not bluffing." The deputy served the papers to Keith later that evening at home. According to the report Margaret received the next day, he'd reacted with loud profanity, then slammed the door so hard it cracked the frame. That was just the beginning. By Friday morning, word had spread through Kalispell. Keith had been let go from Mountain View Auto. His employer, Mike Bennett, called Margaret personally to explain. "I've got a reputation to protect," Mike said, voice low. Customers started asking questions about Keith's credit problems. One even mentioned a forged loan attempt. "I had no choice." Margaret appreciated the call, but not the pity in his voice. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted truth to stand on its own. And truth was becoming a storm. Creditors began circling. One by one, debt collectors arrived at the Rosemont Avenue house. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as men in business suits knocked on the door, carrying clipboards and unpaid invoices. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who'd known Margaret for 20 years, left her a voicemail. "They're coming every day now, honey. Some of them aren't very polite. Danielle looks exhausted. Keith, well, I saw him screaming in the driveway yesterday. Threw a lamp out the front door. Police showed up twice." Margaret didn't listen to the message a second time. She already knew Keith was unraveling. Losing his job meant losing income. Losing access to her money meant no lifeline. The restraining order meant he couldn't confront her directly. He was cornered, and like any cornered animal, he was lashing out. Danielle tried calling next. "Mom," her voice cracked through the voicemail, "we're drowning. Keith says we're being set up, that this is all a misunderstanding, but the bills, they keep coming. They're talking about repossessing the car. I don't know what to do." Margaret pressed delete without hesitation. She had offered a lifetime of lifelines. She was done handing out rescue ropes to people who tied them into nooses. That evening, she took a slow walk by Flathead Lake. The water was calm, mirror-like under the fading light. Each step felt heavier and lighter at the same time. Heavy with memory, light with freedom. A text buzzed in her pocket. It was from Steve, the motel night manager. Mr. Sanders tried to enter the parking lot again tonight. I reminded him about the restraining order. He shouted something about burning it all down before peeling off. You want me to send the camera footage to the cops? Margaret's fingers moved without pause. Yes, send everything. Thank you. This wasn't just about emotional safety anymore. This was about physical protection. She stared out at the water, the colors of sunset bleeding into deep blue. Somewhere across town, her former home was a war zone. But here, this space, this stillness, belonged to her. And she would protect it with everything she had left. The video was only 47 seconds long, but it changed everything. It had been captured by a teenage neighbor across the street, someone Margaret barely remembered, a boy who skateboarded every afternoon and always wore headphones. But that night, as Keith screamed into the night air outside the motel, that boy had been recording from his upstairs window. Keith's voice cracked like thunder across the video. You think you're safe behind that restraining order, old woman? You think you can take everything from me and just disappear? His fists pounded the motel railing. This isn't over. I'll burn this whole damn thing down before I walk away. The phone shook as the teenager gasped. The camera caught the moment Keith noticed he was being filmed. He stormed off, red-faced, muttering something incoherent. The clip ended. By noon the next day, the video had been uploaded to TikTok under the hashtag #ProtectMargaret. By evening, it had gone viral. Thousands of users chimed in, calling Keith a financial abuser, a gaslighter, and worse. The comments flooded in. This poor woman gave them everything and they treated her like a servant. You don't threaten someone like this unless you're guilty. Stay strong, Margaret. We're with you. Margaret never posted the video, never shared it, but she didn't stop it either. Some stories needed to be seen, not just told. Danielle's call came 2 days later. Her voice was hoarse, shaky. Mom, she whispered, I saw the video. She paused. Keith's not who I thought he was. He punched a hole in the wall yesterday, said it was just stress. I don't feel safe. Not really. For a moment, Margaret felt a flicker of the mother she used to be, the one who would have rushed to her daughter's side, packed a bag, and driven over in the night. But that mother had been pushed out the door with a suitcase and a warning to obey or leave. I'm sorry, Danielle, she said quietly. I really am, but you chose him. Rebuilding starts with truth, not panic. Danielle didn't reply. The line went dead a few seconds later. That afternoon, Margaret received an email that stopped her breath mid-sentence. It was from a woman named Claire Benton, director of the Montana Initiative for Survivors of Domestic Violence. They had seen the video. They had read about Margaret's story in a community blog, and they wanted to talk. The email was gentle but clear. We are seeking transitional homes for women leaving abusive situations. Most shelters are overcrowded, under-resourced. We noticed your property is now vacant and legally in your name. If you're open to it, we would love to transform your former house into a safe haven for women starting over, a legacy of protection, of strength. Margaret stared at the message for a long time. The Rosemont Avenue house had always symbolized family. First hers and Harold's, where laughter filled the halls, where Danielle took her first steps. Then, in later years, it became something darker, a place of quiet manipulation, of subtle control, where love had been weaponized and her worth reduced to utility. And now, perhaps, it could become something else entirely. The next morning, she met with Claire in person. The woman's handshake was warm, her tone filled with genuine admiration. We believe your story will give others courage, Claire said softly. This house could be more than a building. It could be a rebirth point for so many. They toured the property together, the cracked door frame, the dented hallway where Keith had thrown his phone in rage, the kitchen Margaret had painted herself 20 years ago, all of it still there, still bruised, still capable of healing. And then, in a moment Margaret hadn't expected, she pulled out the deed and signed the transfer document. Not because she was letting go, but because she was giving forward. When she handed the papers to Claire, her hands trembled, not from sadness, but from something else. Relief. For the first time in years, Margaret Lewis didn't feel like she was losing something. She felt like she was finally choosing something. As she walked away from Rosemont Avenue for the last time, she didn't look back. The past didn't live there anymore. The diner was nearly empty that morning, save for two retired men arguing about baseball at the counter and the waitress humming softly behind the coffee pots. Margaret chose the corner booth, the same one she and Danielle used to sit in on Saturdays when Danielle was in high school, before the lies, before the ultimatums. Danielle arrived late. Her eyes were shadowed, her hair unbrushed. She slid into the booth with none of her usual energy, dropping her purse on the seat beside her like it weighed 100 pounds. Margaret studied her daughter in silence for a moment, noting the nervous tapping of her fingers, the way she couldn't hold her gaze. "Thanks for meeting me," Danielle mumbled. Margaret nodded, wrapping her hands around the coffee mug the waitress had just placed down. "We need to talk, without shouting, without Keith." Danielle's jaw tightened. "He's staying with a friend. After the video, he lost it again. Punched the wall. I don't think I can keep defending him." "Good," Margaret said simply, "because I'm not here to rehash everything. I'm here to give you a choice." Danielle looked up sharply. "A choice?" Margaret took a breath. "I've spent 5 years paying your bills, covering for Keith, letting myself be humiliated in the name of family. I'm done with that, but I'm not done being your mother, if there's still something worth saving between us." Danielle swallowed hard. "I never meant for it to go this far. I thought we were just struggling. And Keith, he said it was temporary." "He said a lot of things," Margaret said, voice level. "But that's not the point. The community knows now. People are watching. They know what happened, at least part of it, but they haven't heard it from you, and they should." Danielle's mouth opened, then closed. Margaret leaned forward. "You can go on pretending Keith was just stressed, that I overreacted, that things were misunderstood, or you can do the hard thing, the right thing. You can stand up in front of the church or write a letter to the paper or make a public post, whatever it is, and tell the truth." Danielle looked stricken. "You want me to humiliate myself?" "No," Margaret said. "I want you to be honest, to own what you did, what you allowed to happen. And if you can't do that, if you're more concerned with what people think than with what's true, then this is the last conversation we'll ever have." Danielle flinched. "You're choosing between your dignity and your pride," Margaret continued, "between blood and lies. I won't be part of a life where I'm expected to play along with the story Keith built to protect himself." Danielle's voice cracked. "You're asking me to choose between you and my husband." "No," Margaret said softly now. "I'm asking you to choose between the truth and a lie." The silence that followed was heavy. Danielle blinked rapidly, looking down at her hands, twisting her wedding band. "I don't know if I can do it," she whispered. "Face everyone. Admit I was part of it." Margaret sat back, letting her daughter's shame simmer in her own mind. "I didn't come here to force you," she said. "I came to offer you a path back." Danielle looked up, tears gathering in her eyes. "If I don't take it, then you'll know," Margaret said gently, "that the person I raised is gone, and I'll move on with my life." Danielle wiped her face, looking younger than she had in years. "When?" "Sunday. Testimony time. St. Paul's. If you're not there, I'll know your answer." Margaret stood, leaving a $20 bill on the table even though her coffee was barely touched. "I hope I see you there," she said, and walked out without looking back. Outside, the clouds were breaking apart, sun bleeding through in golden streaks. Margaret stood still for a moment, breathing in the cool air, letting it cleanse the last tremors of doubt. The choice wasn't hers anymore. It was Danielle's. The message lit up Danielle's screen at midnight. It wasn't from a number she recognized, but the name it mentioned stopped her breath. "He said you'd never find out, but I deserve to know if I'm just a game to him. C." Attached was a screenshot. Keith, her husband, texting a woman named Kara. Sweet nothings, promises, mentions of money coming soon, and starting over in Spokane, just us. Danielle stared at the screen for a long time. Her mind didn't process the words first. It processed the shape of the betrayal. The pieces slid into place one after another like dominoes, each one hitting harder than the last. The secret late-night drives, the overtime shifts, the sudden interest in her mother's accounts, the forged paperwork. It hadn't been stress. It had been scheming. And now she knew exactly who Keith really was. The crack she had been ignoring in their marriage split wide open. In the early morning darkness, Danielle packed a duffel bag with a few essentials: clothes, her wedding album, and her birth certificate. She stared at the frame photo of their wedding day, then took it out of the frame, ripped it once down the middle, and tossed the halves into the trash. By the time Keith returned that morning, groggy and reeking of cheap whiskey, she was waiting with a printed stack of divorce papers and no emotion left in her face. "What the hell is this?" he barked, slamming the papers onto the table. Danielle's voice was cold, flat. "You think I wouldn't find out? Kara? The gambling? The fake loan on my mother's house?" Keith's eyes widened. Just a flash. But that was all the confirmation she needed. "You used me," she continued. "You used my mother. You used everything we had." Keith tried to bluster, to pivot. "Danielle, come on, it wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that," she snapped. "And I'm done. I filed this morning. You're not welcome here anymore." His protest turned into a muttered curse as he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Danielle didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat on the floor, surrounded by silence, and let it all fall away. That night, she called her mother. "Mom," she said quietly, "I was wrong. About everything." There was no lecture on the other end of the line. No scolding. Just a long silence, then a quiet, steady voice. "I know. Are you ready to make it right?" Danielle nodded before realizing her mother couldn't see her. "Yes," she said, voice cracking. "Whatever you need me to do, I'll do it." And so, Sunday came. The sanctuary was full, more crowded than usual. Word had gotten around. There was going to be a testimony, people whispered. Something real, something raw. Margaret sat in her usual pew, hands folded. Her eyes stayed forward, expression unreadable. But inside, her heart pounded, not from nerves, but from the weight of what was to come. The pastor gave the cue. Danielle rose. She walked slowly down the aisle, each step a journey across memories and shame. She wore a simple dress, no makeup, her hair tied back. She didn't look broken, she looked stripped down, honest. She stepped up to the podium, cleared her throat, and looked out at the faces she had known her whole life. "My name is Danielle Sanders," she began, her voice shaking. "And for the past 5 years, my mother has carried the weight of our family almost entirely on her back, financially, emotionally, quietly, without complaint." A few murmurs rippled through the pews. "She paid for our wedding, for our house, for our groceries, and we repaid her with ultimatums and disrespect. We let my husband treat her like a burden, like a servant, and I didn't stop it." A long pause. "I thought I was protecting my marriage, but I was really enabling a lie." She gripped the edge of the podium. "My husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, lied to me. To all of you. He gambled with money that wasn't his. He manipulated my mother's kindness, and he cheated on me while pretending to be a victim." Gasps now, whispers. Danielle's voice cracked. "I chose pride over love, lies over truth. I watched the woman who raised me walk out of her own home, and I let it happen." She turned to Margaret, locking eyes. "But I want to be better. I want to rebuild. And I know it starts here, with the truth." The sanctuary was silent. Then, one by one, people began to stand. First the pastor, then Mrs. Henderson, then Margaret. Applause didn't follow. What followed was deeper than applause, an atmosphere of quiet respect, of community choosing grace over gossip. Danielle stepped down from the podium and returned to her seat, her hands shaking. Margaret reached out and took them in hers. It wasn't forgiveness and a handshake. It was a beginning. The autumn wind nipped through the open church doors, curling around the ankles of the congregation like a quiet reminder of the changing season. It was crisp, honest weather. Too honest, perhaps, for lies to hide in. Danielle stood before the pulpit, trembling but upright, her voice still echoing faintly in the high ceiling of St. Paul's. What she'd just said wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't polished. But it was real. Painfully, undeniably real. In the silence that followed her confession, no one moved. A few in the back shifted uncomfortably. Some bowed their heads, but most just stared, caught in that suspended moment between shame and grace. Margaret didn't move either. Her hands were still clasped in her lap, white-knuckled. Her heart thudded in her chest like a distant drum, but her face betrayed nothing. Danielle stepped down slowly, each footfall sounding louder than the last. She returned to her seat beside Margaret, unsure if she should speak, breathe, or disappear. "I didn't expect applause," Danielle whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret didn't answer. "I know I don't deserve anything," she continued, "but I meant every word." Still no reply. Outside, wind scraped through the bare trees. The sanctuary remained hushed, the pastor waiting quietly at the edge of the platform, giving space to something more sacred than a sermon. Danielle finally turned to her mother. "Mom, please, say something." Margaret's eyes flicked toward her, cool, measured. Behind them was a sea of emotion Danielle could only begin to guess at. "You spoke the truth," Margaret said, each word carefully weighed. "That's a start." Danielle exhaled shakily, tears forming again. "It's not enough, I know, but it's all I have right now." Margaret looked away, her gaze drifting toward the stained glass window above the altar. The light that filtered through was fractured, gold, blue, deep red. It reminded her of something Harold used to say, "Truth is like stained glass. It only shines when the light's behind it." "You've made your confession," Margaret said finally. "But forgiveness is something earned over time, not granted in a single moment." Danielle nodded slowly. "I'm willing to wait. However long it takes." A beat passed. Then two. "I never stopped loving you," Margaret said, voice rough now. "But I stopped trusting you, and I need to learn how to live with that." Danielle reached for her hand, but Margaret didn't offer it. Not yet, not today. The service resumed with a quiet hymn, voices low and wavering. But there was a different energy now, more reverent, less ritualistic. People weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were witnessing something real. Afterward, on the church steps, congregants approached both women with gentle words and tentative embraces. Margaret accepted each gesture with a nod, while Danielle offered quiet gratitude. No one judged, no one scolded. "Truth has a way of resetting things," the pastor said softly as he passed. "You did something most wouldn't." Danielle managed a small, grateful smile. Later, as they stood in the parking lot beside Margaret's car, the wind gusted again. Leaves scattered across the pavement like little exclamation points to everything that had been said. "I'm staying with a friend for now," Danielle said, "just until I figure things out." Margaret nodded. "And I've spoken with an attorney. The divorce is moving forward." Another nod. Danielle looked at her mother then, fully, the way a daughter sees not just a parent, but a person, worn, wise, and still standing after a storm. "I'm proud of you," Margaret said at last quietly. Danielle blinked hard. "Really?" "Yes, not for what you did, but for what you chose to do after." Danielle stepped forward. "Can I see you again? Maybe next week? Coffee?" Margaret hesitated, then gave a faint, tired smile. "We'll see." Danielle understood. Healing wasn't instant. It was a winter thaw, slow, uncertain, but inevitable if the warmth stayed long enough. She turned and walked to her car, the cold air tugging at her coat, her steps lighter than they'd been in weeks. Margaret watched her go, then looked up at the sky. Gray clouds stretched like a faded quilt overhead, but somewhere beyond them, she knew the sun was trying to break through. one day at a time. 3 days passed after the church service. 3 days of silence. No phone calls, no texts, no Keith. Then, on a foggy Thursday morning, Danielle received an envelope wedged into the mail slot of her temporary apartment. No return address, just her name scrawled in Keith's jagged handwriting. Inside was a single letter, folded around a flash drive. She unfolded the pages slowly, her hands trembling. Danielle, I know you'll hate me more after this. Maybe you should. Maybe it's the only honest reaction left, but I'm done pretending. I'm done lying. You deserved the truth years ago, but I didn't know how to give it without destroying the last part of myself that still cared about anyone. The letter went on to admit everything. The gambling debts, the fake paperwork, the money he funneled into an account under a different name to keep his affair going, the way he baited Margaret into leaving because he feared she would one day cut him off. You were the perfect shield, he wrote. If people saw you backing me, they wouldn't question anything. I knew it was wrong, but I told myself I was protecting our future. Really, I was just buying time. Danielle sat in stunned silence. She plugged the flash drive into her laptop, her stomach clenched. There were videos, recordings, snippets from his phone, conversations where he mocked Margaret's kindness, discussed manipulating Danielle's guilt, bragged about how easy it is to spin her. Danielle didn't finish them all. She didn't have to. By sunset, she packed the letter and flash drive into a padded envelope, labeled it for attorney, evidence, and dropped it into a mailbox on Main Street. Keith was gone. Rumor had it he'd left town overnight, possibly headed west. No goodbyes, no explanations, just a trail of betrayal behind him. But somehow, knowing he'd finally admitted it, knowing she wasn't crazy, brought Danielle a strange, hollow relief. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret stood barefoot on the wooden deck of a newly purchased lakeside cabin. It wasn't large, but it was enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to begin again. The air smelled like pine and memory. Flathead Lake shimmered beyond the dock, silver and calm, mirroring the peace Margaret hadn't realized she'd been craving for decades. She had sold what little remained of her former life, liquidated the last of her retirement accounts, finalized the donation of the family home to the Women's Recovery Housing Initiative, and signed the papers on this cabin with nothing but a suitcase and a quiet resolution. Here she would heal. She'd already placed a photo of Harold on the mantel, and beside it a small framed picture of Danielle as a toddler, smiling, arms covered in finger paint. That night, while boiling water for tea, her phone buzzed on the counter. A single message. Danielle, I want to start over if you'll let me. Margaret stared at the words for a long time. Then she smiled. Not a broad grin, but the kind that comes after storms have passed. The next morning, she texted back, Saturday, 10 a.m., the old coffee shop on Oak Street. You bring the questions, I'll bring the listening. Saturday came. The cafe hadn't changed much. Same chipping paint on the sign, same mismatched chairs, same waitress with the tired smile and sharp memory. Margaret arrived early, claiming the booth by the window. Sunlight pooled on the table like a gentle offering. She sipped her coffee slowly, letting the warmth sink into her fingers. At 10:03, the bell above the door jingled. Danielle entered hesitantly, her face bare, her hands clenched. She spotted her mother and paused, then walked forward, slower with each step. Margaret stood. They didn't hug, not yet, but when they sat down across from each other, something eased between them. So, Margaret said softly, stirring her cup, shall we begin again? Danielle nodded, eyes glistening. Yes, she whispered. Please? Outside, the wind had stilled. The trees swayed gently, and somewhere deep inside both women, trust began to thaw, fragile, tentative, but real. It wasn't money that had ever held them together. It was the courage to come back, to try again, and to say, finally, fully, I still choose you.